And so while we're at one of the worst ever times of mental health in the entire history of Western culture, in terms of number of people who are sick and number and ability to effectively treat those people and give them relief, we're also hopefully entering what could be one of the most transformative times for mental health, where these new tools are coming up that are actually showing that we might start to be able to use the cure word for mental health. And that's never been a word we've been allowed to use before.
Okay, welcome back, or welcome to the Finding Mastery podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Gervais, by trade and training a high-performance psychologist. And I'm super excited to welcome Dr. Dave Rabin back to the podcast for this week's conversation. I think it's fair to say we all know a thing or two about stress. Hopefully, we've all found a practice or several to help us manage it. Now, our guest today has gone a few steps further. Dave has dedicated much of his life's work as a neuroscientist, a psychiatrist, and health tech entrepreneur to studying the impacts of chronic stress and developing groundbreaking approaches to stress management, treatment-resistant illness, and our body's relationship to trauma. As co-founder and chief medical officer of Apollo Neuro, Dr. Dave led the way in creating the first scientifically validated wearable technology that actively improves your health by strengthening your nervous system and resilience to stress over time through the use of touch therapy. So the Apollo wearable doesn't just read your biomarkers like many other wearables, it's actually helping to promote a state change. I mean, this tech for me and for many of the folks I work with is a game changer, and I don't say that lightly. It's one of the reasons I'm so stoked to have Dave on the podcast and to have partnered with his company, Apollo Neuro. Last time he was on the podcast, that was over 2 years ago, we touched a great deal on how powerful the mind is, why we are uniquely suited to adapt to and to overcome adversity. Now, in this conversation, we dive even deeper into the science of stress, why we may be entering a transformative time for mental health, and some of the non-invasive alternative therapies that he believes can help us in our respective journeys to heal ourselves. He's a scientist who truly thinks outside the box, and I can't wait for you to hear his extraordinary insights. So with that, let's dive into this week's conversation with Dr. Dave Rabin. All right, Dave, it's been like 2.5 years since you were on this podcast last, and I love your work. I've loved following what you're doing. And can you just maybe kind of almost like push back your chair a little bit and tell us what you've been up to, and then give us a sense of like where your head is at now and maybe the state of the union when it comes to stress and anxiety and even mental health, from a social standpoint, from a society standpoint.
For sure. I think that's a great place to start. And thank you again for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. And I've been loving the conversations you've been having lately. I find them very inspiring, and at a time where, we really do need more tools than we've ever had to deal with the onslaught of incoming stress that we face on a daily basis. It is welcome to hear you bring those insights to the community. And
thank you.
And I think that really speaks to the answer of your first question, which is, that people are, more stressed out than ever right now. And I think one of my friends showed me a statistic the other day that, isn't like a perfect scientific statistic, but it was actually very interesting, which is that the average human being is consuming in the first 15 minutes of waking up and looking at their phones as much information as people were consuming in a week of being alive 50 years ago before cell phones. And that is pretty profound, right? Just the amount of incoming information that comes in through that little box that we hold in our hands all the time, and all the screens we're constantly surrounded by is a lot. And we forget that, I think we are sensory organs as human beings. Like, our entire bodies were born to feel, and we're not taught how to feel the stuff that matters and to kind of let the stuff that doesn't matter so much and is not true and useful to us go. And when we're constantly bombarded by information, it causes overstimulation and stress, and that stress has to be dealt with. And I think what we're seeing in the clinical community when, with our clients and more people coming to us, especially Gen Z folks, is that people aren't getting taught the tools, right? They're not learning in school or from their parents, because often their parents weren't taught. I know I wasn't taught growing up about breath work, intentional breathing, meditation, yoga, exercise, having a good regular exercise routine. That was one of the things that I did on my own because I love sports and athletics and competitive engagements like that. But in general, a lot of this other stuff wasn't taught. And so we're seeing now the downstream effects of overstimulation on a consistent basis, constant incoming information from news, responsibilities, work, children, etc. And then all of that without the tools to deal with it. And so I think the call to action that we're trying to really bring forward is, how do we get more people the tools they need to deal with what's coming in?
And okay, so first and foremost, yes, our ancient brain has not caught up with the modern day rhythm. As a neuroscientist, I want to just kind of think about our brains, that the statement that we're making, that we've got more information flooding in. And is it the speed of information? Because we've always had information coming, but we were able to look on the horizon. We were able to, be outside a bit more. And our brain has not caught up with the modern way of processing. Is that where you're thinking about it? Or is it something else? It's like more the speed of information as opposed to the cadence between outdoor, indoor, horizon-focused processing as opposed to like four inches in front of your eyeballs?
Yeah, I think so. It's a great question, right? And I love kind of reframing it that way. And maybe it's even more simple than that. It's that back in the dark ages, back before we had screens as children, back before we had technology soothing us when we were upset rather than us having to learn how to do it ourselves, we still had a lot of stress, right? Dealing with the Black Plague, big stressor, dealing with all the other adversity of not necessarily having enough food or water, or not having acceptance by your community, or having actual predators around, which we don't often anymore, right? These are all very real stressors, but they occur usually in the past, they occurred in bursts, and you'd have a period where you don't have food, and then you get food, and then you have food for a time, and you don't have that lack of food stress anymore. And then you have a predator, you deal with that predator, and then you don't have predator stress anymore. But it's not constant every moment of every day, like existential kind of stress, like spending a lot of time thinking about things we can't control, or negative intrusive thinking, or resisting resisting what's happening around us. And I think a lot of it has to do with, it's two things, right? Number one, like you talk about a lot, it's like allostatic load, like how much load is there that we have to deal with? And then how well trained are our skills to deal with said load? And I think the bigger challenge, we do have a lot of incoming load now that is perhaps more information load wise than we did before. And work doesn't just go 9 to 5 now, it continues on to your phone when you go home. But we also have not practiced the same skill sets, like the mindfulness and the self-awareness techniques and the self-soothing techniques that many people in the past had to learn, because they didn't have smartphones and they didn't have technologically advanced tools that could actually soothe your body for you without, or distract you, or numb you to stress. And so, right. And now that's what we're seeing a lot. And parents don't know any better because they're stressed out. So they're like, oh, my kid's upset. Let's give them iPhone, or let's give them an iPad or something, right?
Right.
And from a psychiatrist and psychologist, neuroscience perspective, that's like the worst thing you could do to your child, because they need at a young age, at the youngest age possible, to learn how to self-soothe. And so if we can teach them how to do that on their own by either role modeling it themselves, or kind of helping them understand how to do it, helping them watch other kids doing it, learning how to just focus on your breath, learning how to give yourself a hug, learning how to do, take it out on the field, go exercise, go run, right? Those kinds of self-soothing techniques get trained and practiced over time so that we can take on more load. But if we haven't mastered those techniques or haven't even learned how to do them from the beginning, all of a sudden the load starts to go up and we're like, well, what do I do now? Right? I'm completely overwhelmed and helpless.
Okay. I love where you're taking this. And because you just said a phrase that is, it's specific. Allostatic load is something you and I might talk about on a regular basis, but could you make sure that we're getting some clarity there and how that an allostatic load leads to chronic stress? And maybe just open up allostatic load and acute, moderate, and chronic stress as a clarifying point.
For sure. So in general, allostatic load is a word that kind of means and is commonly referred to as like the cumulative overall burden of life events or stress or any kind of like incoming input to us. So it's just like the stuff we have to deal with is another way of thinking about it. And it is inclusive of everything: physical, emotional, mental, pain, spiritual, everything. Everything we have to deal with kind of falls under that umbrella. And you probably have a more specific description of that term that you use for athletes, but so it's
that's
similar.
It's the cumulative impact on not being able to shed or work well with a stressor. And so something my dad used to always say to me is like, and I actually don't know the origin of it. I think I do, but I don't know the full origin. This is a good prompt for me to go do that. Maybe you do. But this term gunny sacking. And it's not like one little pebble that you put in your sack is too much, but when you haven't emptied your sack or to release in whatever said way, we hold on, and before you know it, the bottom of the satchel breaks open, and we kind of lose all of our gunny sacks or lose all of our gunnies. So can before we take it one step further, the state of the union for mental health, are we on a negative slope? Do you think we're trending even? And you and I both know the data, but like, where are you feeling the state of the union right now?
How do I frame this positively? Because it's not all positive. I think the challenge, so number one, it's critically important that we maintain hope as a community that we can solve these hard problems, right? Mental health challenges are probably the single most expensive and most challenging issue to solve of our generation. And we have not successfully figured it out yet. So the challenge from what we've seen, and just going back a few years to like pre-COVID times to where we are right now, is that pre-COVID, we were going down a very very mediocre trajectory as Western medicine practitioners of mental health, in that the most medications and most tools we were using, while they work for people who participate in them, do not work for probably 50% roughly of people long term. So that means that over 50% of people, or at least 50% of people who ever receive a diagnosis of a mental illness, have that diagnosis for life. And that includes substance use disorders, which went up dramatically during COVID, and mental illness diagnoses went up dramatically during COVID, like depression and PTSD. So that is kind of where we're at in the Western medical model. And we don't have a lot of viable solutions that have really come to the surface, aside that have actually been fully integrated into Western medical care for mental health, except for two things: psychedelic assisted therapy and wearable tech and general like neurostimulation technology that's non-drug. And that is where things become a little more positive, because if you look at the data that's coming out from these paradigm shifting tools, which are non-drug tools that allow you to, like a wearable, like Apollo, that can deliver vibration to the body that helps the body restore balance naturally, or tools like psychedelic medicines, where used properly, they can kind of give the brain a bit of a neurochemical reset in therapy that allows people to access states of vulnerability that facilitate healing and unlocking of our potential. That these techniques are actually being shown to be some of the most groundbreaking, most paradigm shifting tools we've ever seen in mental health. So it's very interesting, because that the pendulum always swings both ways, right? And so while we're at one of the worst ever times of mental health in the entire history of Western culture in terms of number of people who are sick and number and ability to effectively treat those people and give them relief. We're also hopefully, and what the data is showing, entering what could be one of the most transformative times for mental health, where these new tools are coming up that are actually showing that we might start to be able to use the cure word for mental health. And that's never been a word we've been allowed to use before. So
that's a bold statement. Like, are you thinking about that word?
I think about it every day.
So this is where I want to get into the conversation about psychedelics, and I want to get into the conversation about technologies that are assisting decreasing allostatic load. And I want to go upstream quickly and see if we can get it down into a sentence for you, or two, of course, which is like, in your best estimate, what is the main source of people's stress and anxiety right now? And I'm purposely putting stress and anxiety together, knowing clearly that they are different. But what is the main source for people's stress and anxiety right now?
I think the most common answers that I hear, or that I would typically give, would be like news, work, responsibilities, and those kinds of things. But I think that if I were to actually narrow it down to one thing, I would say it's the systematic denial of our feelings.
God,
because
I love
we're made to feel. Like, we were born to feel, and everything makes us feel. And so if we deny those feelings, then we get stuck, right? And so it's really about feeling what comes up that allows us to process and then let go, as you were saying earlier, let go of the load. But when we don't allow ourselves to feel, then the load accumulates, and that's when we wind up having problems and getting sick.
Okay, so let's do a quick little, I'll take the lead here, the difference between feelings and emotions. And for the community that hasn't done a deep dive here, we had Dr. Antonio Damasio on, which was just a masterclass on what makes humans special, which is our ability to feel. So just quickly, emotions are physiological states that we can observe, and they are responses to internal processing or external cues. So I could think about something and it could trigger emotions. Now, the emotions, again, we can observe. It's like sweaty hands or, pupil dilation or constriction or whatever. Like, we can see it in people. Breathing, heart rate, Feelings are the interpretation of that emotional experience. And so what you're saying is the way that you're interpreting your experience is so grounding and so fundamental to a human experience that when you become sophisticated at working with your feelings, you no longer are carrying around one load and another load and the third load. Before you know it, you're overloaded. You're actually working well with letting go and shedding and processing that quote unquote load. Do I have that right from your perspective?
Almost completely.
Okay, so please add to it.
The only thing I would add is that there's a discrepancy there where feeling is not just what you described. It can be that, but what comes first is the feeling part of feeling, right? Which is just not thinking. It's not thinking about what that emotion means to you and interpreting it. It's just feeling it.
Oh, cool.
Right?
Yeah, nice nuance. That's nice. So it's independent, it's related and independent, that does not have to have thinking to analyze the experience.
Right. There's no analysis required for feeling. That's the beauty of feeling. It's literally just non-judgmental experience. It's like, I have an emotion. Maybe that emotion is joy and maybe it's anger, but it's something. And rather than judge it, I'm just going to feel what it is and just try to understand what this emotion is trying to signal to me right now. What is this telling me that is going on inside me or in my environment that I'm supposed to pay attention to? That's what emotions are. They're literally signals that are trying to tell us to pay attention to something in a certain way. And so the interpretation of that gets really messy when we start to interpret too early and analyze too early and prejudge. Because we're like, oh, I feel angry. I remember what that feels like. I remember my parents telling me when I was a kid that I'm not allowed to feel that way. So that means that's bad. I must be bad for feeling this way. What's wrong with me? All of a sudden, your ability to interpret that signal has completely been tossed out the window. And you've already judged it and judged yourself in the process. You've eliminated your ability to adapt smoothly to that experience. So what we teach is non-judgmental feeling, which is saying reserve judgment. Judgment is part of the interpretation process. Just feel the emotion first for the signal that it is, not good or bad, and then let that guide you towards the interpretation before you've made a decision off the bat.
Okay, so let's do that with anxiety. Let's do that with an anxiousness. So I start thinking about, okay, cool. Let's make it like super concrete. And we can go two ways, right? Like we could go like, let's go with a thought stem. So I have a thought and I'm thinking about something that is scaring me. So let's go with like, I'm going to let someone down. Let's just oversimplify it. I've got this thoughts and I'm going to let somebody down. And can you walk me through a best practice?
For sure. So the first thing I would ask you is, what is the circumstance of you having that thought?
Like, where am I having it? Or
yeah, just give me an example like of a situation that might result in you having a thought like that.
Well, I'm making breakfast and I start thinking about the decisions I'm going to make in my business. And I've got to lay some bets. And if I don't lay the right bets, we don't grow fast enough. If I lay too big of a bet, it could blow the thing up. And so I start thinking about, the full team here at Finding Mastery.
Okay. And then the thoughts come up about potentially letting them down in the future.
That's right. Yep. That's right. Yep.
So
they've trusted me to make these decisions, and
right.
I'm making it up as I go. Right.
Yeah, and that's a lot of responsibility, and it's a lot to think about because you're thinking about yourself and you're thinking about your business and you're thinking about everybody that business touches.
Amen.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge stress for any of us business owners, startup founders, daily, every moment. So you think about that, and I'll relate it to the example of public speaking. Okay. Right? Mm-hmm. Public speaking is the greatest fear, and failure at public speaking is the greatest fear that that human beings state they have, more than death. They fear messing up while public speaking. And what happens is when you think about that, what other people are thinking about you, for instance, or not being able to meet up to other people's expectations while you are in the act of performing something for those people, like making a really important decision or giving a talk, what are you doing? You're taking energy away from doing the talk or making the decision, and you're putting it on future casting into what could be. But we're notoriously terrible about predicting the future. It's something that we actually don't have that much control over. What we do have control over, however, is what we do right now. And what we know, right, if I were to ask you, do you think you're going to give a better talk if you have 100% of your available mental and physical resources? Or do you think you're going to make a better decision with 100% of your resources? Or do you think you're going to make a better decision with 60 or 70% of your resources available to you and 30% future casting?
But Doc, I know, Doc, but like, I just like the thoughts come up and man, I feel it and I can work with it like beforehand. But then when I'm walking on stage, I'm like, why did I do this to myself? My heart is pounding. This is actually, I enjoy public speaking, but like my heart is pounding.
That's what happens.
Yeah. And like, I don't know what to do with that. And yes, I want to be all in, but it becomes kind of overwhelming and I can feel my hand shaking and.
Yeah. And so it starts with that. It's what you're describing is the real experience, right? That's the felt experience that the body starts to manifest as a result of spending time paying attention to things that we can't control. So what you're describing when you're talking about future, thinking about the future or thinking about the past and worrying or regretting, right? And what you're talking about, for example, thinking about what other people think about us, which we can't control, we can only bring our best selves to every moment, right? And so when your body's sending you that signal to say, you're sweating, your heart is beating fast, what that signal is not good or bad. That signal is your body signaling to you, I detect threat. I detect uncertainty. I detect things in the environment that I'm paying attention to that are uncertain or unfamiliar to me. And those could be things, and typically are things, that we don't have control over. And so the techniques that we use, that we focus on, and the way we think about anxiety is, in general, is anxiety is the signal that arises in us that can come up in lots of different ways. It can come up as chills. It can come up as like tension in our solar plexus, racing heart, sweating, all the things we talk about, racing thoughts. And it comes up as a signal there's uncertainty in our environment. Again, it's not good or bad. So what it's telling us is pay attention to what is uncertain around you. Address it. And if it's not a survival threat, then let it go, because it's not going to help you right now. But again, this is a very, very fundamental cognitive behavioral therapy technique, which is called thought questioning. And this is something that we should teach to every single human being very young, but we don't. And it just involves doing yourself the respect of asking yourself, when I have a thought, is this thought true and useful to me right now in this moment? And if it is, and it passes that test, then we allow it in and we pay attention to it. But if it's, and those are usually things that pass, are things we have control over. And like, what I'm bringing my best self to this moment. But if we spend and allocate time and resources allowing untrue and useless thoughts into our attention, it's like letting a vampire into your consciousness, right? It just sucks energy away from you so that you don't have those resources to bring your best self and to be your full self when you're presenting or when you're making decisions for your team, because you're distracted by what people are thinking about you or what people might think about you or what you actually might think about yourself, right? So the anxiety is a signal. Anxiety is actually the key to help people start to sift through what is actually making us feel unpleasant. It's not bad. And it's reserving that judgment of the feeling and just feeling it that allows it to actually pass. And I actually addressed my own public speaking anxiety years ago this way, which I could talk about later. But it was through these practices of breathing and presentness that actually helped me realize in the moment that I was one of those people spending like 50% of my time on stage thinking about what the people listening to me were thinking about me. And I just started to focus on what I was talking about, because I knew that I know what I know, and I know they're here to hear me talk, and I'm going to give a better talk if I just talk and not think about them. And of course, I gave better talks, and it self-validated for me.
Yeah. Me, the big unlock was going from, I have to be great for them. They're expecting something from me that, like, I don't want to disappoint that narrative, to this is a great opportunity. And what a privilege it is to share and talk about things that I'm still learning and I love learning more about. Before we get to the tech and psychedelics, like what are most of us doing wrong when it comes with working and managing stress, working with and managing stress?
A lot of things. We're not grateful enough, for one. You know, we don't operate with grace, right? We don't prioritize grace. I think historically, grace as a word used to be like an ultimate goal for human beings. It's like an angelic level of being where you're just free flowing smoothly without resistance, like water flowing down a river, right? That's life. That's like Bruce Lee, right? You're just flowing. And that is, I think, one of the things that we have often forgotten about, because we spend so much time thinking about what we don't have, and spending so much time watching other people and wanting what they have, and then regretting things that we've done in the past, and, you know, grilling ourselves and judging ourselves for not doing enough and not being good enough. And there's a constant comparisons, but we're all born great as we are. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's like teaching people that they are born great and they don't need to do anything other than just be themselves and participate in the life experience of just self-discovery, which is what life is all about. That's it, you know, and that's what helps us be present. And when we're present, we bring all of ourselves to every moment. When we're not present, we just don't. And so that's this practice of embodied being, right? It's like we talk about our minds could be anywhere, past, present, or future, but they're usually in the past or the future. And our bodies are always in the here and now. They don't go anywhere. So that's why breathing and meditation and yoga and all these like body somatic practices that embody our minds into our bodies, they remind us of their connection, are so inherently healing. And I think if we all remember to do more of that stuff more often, it just makes us more present. And like you talk about all the time, it just brings more of us to every single moment.
Okay. Like the word grace, if my wife and I were to have a daughter, we wanted to name her Grace. And so we had a son, and we named him Grayson. And so the word grace matters to us. And there's multiple words, and I encourage people to look up the word grace. Like, it's this union with quote unquote God. It is a simple elegance and refinement of movement. So there's a gracefulness in the way that we conduct ourselves. And you can also have an inner grace, which is the way that you do like an Aikido or Judo or a mind like water, to quote Bruce Lee, in the way that you work from the inside out. And so that word grace, I love that. I've never talked about this. And I love that you bring that up as a first mover when it comes to working with stress. And so all of the psychological skills.
We all need goals, right? We all need goals.
So, okay, one more thing, and I keep saying this before we get into Apollo Neuro and psychedelics, is being and becoming. I'd love your quick riff on the tension between those two and the ambition of becoming one's best. And I think I heard you say as a first principle, you're already it. You're already, quote unquote, did you say perfect? I can't remember how you said it, but
great.
You're great. You're already great. So that tension, and I listen to the hustle hard mentality and I put my hands over my head like, what? Like, that's not it. It's not enough. So, but there does require hard work to become.
Suck it up, Michael.
Yeah. Like, it's not enough. And I'm not saying hard work isn't required. It is, but there needs to be a second kind of beat there. So can you talk about the difference between becoming and being, the tension there?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, becoming is like the future look, and being is what we are right now. And we are human beings. So inherently, being born a human being means that we are being first. At least that's what we should teach, but we don't really teach that. Eastern techniques and tribal techniques do a much better job of it. But in the Western culture, everything is more aligned around what are we becoming, right? What are we what is our trajectory aimed at? And I think the magic is really in the middle between both, because we want to be able to be present as often as possible and just be ourselves, but we also want to achieve. We want to, many of us have ambitions, and discovery itself is one of the most exciting experiences you can have as a human being, right? Is to discover something new and feel like you did it. Like you were involved in this process of learning something new about yourself or new about the world you didn't know before. That's why kids are so happy all the time. Every single moment's a new discovery for them. And so I think the balance between being and becoming is like allowing some of that childhood innocence of being and discovery to come through with us into our adulthood, right? And to respect the inner child and to respect play, and to not just focus on producing, but to respect play and that balance. And it's the interplay between them where being present allows us to bring more of ourselves to every moment, which increases our ability to self-discover with ourselves, which then increases our ability to become what we were ultimately meant to be. The hardest part for people in this process is accepting the premise of all of this self-discovery stuff, which we have to accept in science, which is you don't know what you're going to become, right? We can't know what we're going to become. We can't necessarily know what we're capable of, and we can't necessarily know what we're discovering. That's why the process is so exciting.
Oh, come on. Because I'll tell you what, like that return to innocence is an important word, a phrase for me and my family. And like, I think about that a lot. So my day, the way I organize my day is I run to the edge, to the frontier, to my best ability. And then I need to return to a place of high ground, a place where I get out of the water, the rapids, and I can like dry off. Okay. So I'm mixing a metaphor here a little bit, but this is where I use your technology that you introduced to the world a couple years ago. I use it twice a day. And so I use it every time I do something intense. Right afterwards, I use it to downregulate with speed. And so I use your tech to dry off, if you will, from the rapids of life, so that I can return to that innocence, if you will. It improves my HRV, it lowers my heart rate in general, and it gives me that that sense of like, I'm not in threat, so I can be more closely connected to that innocent, playful beginner's mind. And I use it right before I go to bed to help me ease into a sleep state. So I think it's an eloquent transition to talk about your tech here for a minute and like the research that you're doing around it, the peer-reviewed clinical studies that you've done. So where do you want to take us when it comes to Apollo Neuro? What you're excited about? Maybe we just start with what it does. That would be probably pretty grounding. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of talked about it a little bit in the way you use it. And, Apollo is a wearable device. It can be worn anywhere on the body. I have it on my chest. I think you wear it on your wrist or ankle, right?
I wear it on my wrist.
On your wrist, yeah. So I have it on my chest with a clip. It's a little device that you can wear that vibrates at very gentle rhythms that soothe the body. And they soothe the body in a similar way physiologically as soothing touch or holding a purring animal or having ocean waves wash over you or getting a hug from a friend. And that's a highly conserved, evolutionarily conserved safety pathway that it exists in every human being and every mammal that has existed for, it seems like over 200 million years, hardwired into our nervous systems since the very first mammals were nursing their young after birth. That induced this touch relationship that facilitates oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin release, and bonding, mother-child bonding, right? That is fundamentally the safety signal that everyone remembers, whether you can consciously remember it or not. It's a feeling that we all remember. And so studying that, we realized that people under stress weren't getting enough of that. They weren't getting enough of that safety feedback to combat the stress and the threat that was overstimulating people. And we realized that you could, by sending these gentle, soothing rhythms to the body, you could kind of nudge the body back into its balanced state and back into a state of embodied being rather than a state of up here thinking about the past or the future and regretting and forecasting all the time, but really a state of embodied presentness. And so that was what the technology does and what it feels like. And we developed it originally for folks with PTSD and veterans. We were studying at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Psychiatry. And I'm a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. And I was working at the university at the time doing this work. And then we made a bunch of prototypes and realized that it worked for us and it worked for healthy folks and people who were just having day-to-day, regular, busy, stressful lives. And when we started to see how much our colleagues visit doctors and nurses and business people, accountants and fighter pilots and all these different kinds of people started using this technology, I think you were actually one of the first to get our early prototypes. Mm-hmm. And the responses were so good that we realized it just had to be a consumer wellness product that everybody could access. And then we started to do a lot more studies, and the studies started to show that Apollo reliably improves resilience and recovery and heart rate variability. And that has impacts on sleep and focus and calm and creativity and helps us access just more of ourselves, which is really exciting.
Yeah, okay, so I take potential conflicts of interest seriously, as I know you do. And like I don't know another way to say it, but when you sent me your tech and I put it on, I was like, oh shit, this is great. And it was one of those moments where I'm like, why didn't I think about this? Like not only is it working and experientially I experienced it, which is a good product, but it's grounded in good science. Like maybe you can talk about vagal tone for just a moment here. And so the point is like you sent it and I was like, this is great. And then I use it every day. And then we are able to have a business relationship where, hopefully we as a community are supporting your business. Like, I don't know if I don't feel like this is a conflict because I'm talking about it, but I want your business to explode. And because in return, the community of people that are using it are going to feel better, are going to live better, are going to be more eloquent with the stressors that they experience in life. They're going to downregulate quicker, and your tech also helps increase stimulation by getting people geared up and ready to go do something hard, which I don't use it for that, but I use it for the downregulation.
Right.
And so I couldn't be more bullish on what you're doing. And I just want to say thank you for, supporting our community and supporting this podcast and being an innovator in the space, using the beautiful science of psychology and neuroscience at service for innovation and product. And so I don't say that lightly, Dave. I really don't. And so I'm stoked on what you're building. And
I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And it's not lost on either of us that, according to NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, like in the US, 31.1% of adults are experiencing anxiety over the course of their life. This is a real deal, a real product that you have that can help with it, specifically with the allostatic load and as a way to keep at bay, potential anxiety, and also to work with anxious states. So nice job. Like, I'm so stoked for what you're doing. And then can you you hinted that you built it because of 4 people with trauma. And this is maybe a nice little bridge. It's a gentle little vibration. Like, why is the vibration so important? Maybe this is a tee up for vagal tone. And then how does that relate to some of the psychedelics and trauma that you're finding to be important?
That's a great question. So maybe I'll start by just telling you the story about how we actually discovered Apollo in its whole the technology behind Apollo and its wholeness, and that'll give you the connection to psychedelics. So vagal tone is increased. So vagal tone, which is the parasympathetic recovery nervous system that exists in every human being and every mammal, and actually probably in every single reptile as well, is critical for regulating our recovery response, and it is in balance with sympathetic tone, right? So just quick recap: sympathetic fight or flight system is responsible for responding to threat, survival threat, or perceived survival threat. Let's throw emails and news and responsibilities into perceived survival threat. And then there's actual survival threats, which are like lack of food, lack of water, lack of air, predators, immediate death, etc. Right? So those two are very different, but the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system gets turned on in both cases. And we have to be the ones to make sure we remind ourselves what is actual survival and what's not actual survival. Because when that system gets triggered, vagal tone comes way down, the recovery response nervous system comes down in activity, and all our whole body diverts all blood flow to, and this is what happens in people with PTSD all the time, is all blood flow gets diverted to heart, lungs, skeletal muscles, motor cortex of our brain, and fear center of our brain. Why? To fight, flight, or get out of the situation, right? And so we want that to happen. We want all the resources to go to those systems when we're actually having a survival threat. But when we're answering emails, we don't want all of our resources going to our skeletal muscles and our heart and our lungs and our fear center. We want them to go to our thoughtful and empathy parts of our brains, right? Because we're not actually under threat. People with PTSDs, their bodies, and even veterans are so interesting to work with because they are some of the most highly trained, physically and mentally trained individuals that are, live around us. They're trained incredibly well, and yet they suffer a degree of difficulty with symptoms when they come back from being active duty that they can't function day to day, many of them, without a lot of help in regular civilian life. But they were doing way harder stuff at overseas, right? Or in battle. And so that always interested me because I was like, well, what's wrong with these folks that they can't adapt when they come home to this easier life? And it turns out it's because their stress response system is sending all their resources to their heart, lungs, and motor cortex and skeletal muscles and fear center. And it doesn't detect safety. And when safety is not detected, the vagal system, which is responsible for recovery, it's responsible for sleep, immunity, empathy, digestion and food absorption, right? Regulating metabolism, all of those things are resource depleted for sometimes years. And so what happens? Those systems dysfunction because they're not getting the resources they need. They're still being asked to function, but they're not getting the resources they need, and they have less blood flow, so there's less waste clearance, which means there's more waste accumulation in those organ systems. And so of course they dysfunction. And so as we were seeing these patterns, and you're familiar with all of this, but as we're seeing these patterns in the community, we realized, hey, what actually works for these people? And because none of the medications were working for PTSD, they have like a 30% success rate. So it's very poor. So we And the NIMH hasn't approved new medication for PTSD since like Prozac and Zoloft over 17 years ago. So we're really at a loss. And then, of course, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy comes around, right? And MDMA in the FDA trials right now with MAPS, which MDMA is a methamphetamine analog, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, that selectively increases serotonin and some other things, but serotonin in particular, in the emotional cortex of our brains. And what does it do? In therapy, it helps us feel safe. It amplifies neurochemistry in the safety pathways of the brain. And when I learned this from studying MDMA therapy, because it works so well, and by works so well, I mean it's the best treatment we've ever had for PTSD. It has an 88% response rate in the phase 3 trials with people with fully treatment-resistant PTSD, with just 3 doses and 12 weeks of psychotherapy, 88% response rate. And 67% of people are no longer meeting diagnostic criteria 2 months out.
Cure.
Right?
Cure is why you're getting...
It's the closest thing we've ever had at a glimpse of a cure for a mental illness.
Okay, so I want to just highlight something quickly. This is not taking a dose of MDMA or 3 and saying, I'm good. This is actually at a microdose, or the level that you're describing, is helping somebody feel safe. And so it's enhancing one of the great tools inside of psychotherapy is the relationship, the kind, empathetic, sometimes challenging relationship with the person. So it's increasing safety and connection. And then when that happens, magically people are like, oh, I'm different. I feel different. So that is a really important part that I don't think it is widely expressed enough. And I'm so glad that you just brought that piece up.
Well, and that's what was so interesting to us, right? Because we're like, how can this medicine with this therapy just in 3 doses possibly be so effective? And then I was trained to do the therapy myself, thanks to the good graces of Dr. Rick Doblin, who's executive director of MAPS, who encouraged us at the time in 2016 to start studying the mechanism of MDMA in humans. And what we found is that MDMA in the therapy is helping people feel so radically safe by molecularly amplifying safety pathways in the client's brain that we are already setting the foundation for by this relationship, as you said, that they feel safe enough to be vulnerable, right? So think about that. That's all it is. It's safe enough to be vulnerable. And vulnerability, exposure to vulnerability, it unlocks healing, because that's the stuff that's hurting, right? And if we're afraid of the stuff that's hurting, or we shame it, or we guilt ourselves about it, or we judge ourselves for it, then we don't feel safe or comfortable exposing that vulnerability, right? It feels shameful. It feels upsetting. And so the medicine helps to, just for a brief period, 4 to 8 hours, just kind of like quiet that part of the brain molecularly, amplifying the safety of the therapeutic environment. And then that allows people to feel safe enough to heal and to be vulnerable. And so we saw that mechanism and we said, well, what else does that? Soothing touch. And so that ended up going back to the lab years later, or years of research experimenting with different vibration patterns. And we figured out how to deliver not the full MDMA effect, but at least the safety part of it. Because MDMA does a lot of things, but the safety part of it was something that we figured out how to deliver by sending these very, very reliable rhythms to the body that are similar to the breath pattern, the breath resonance state that we call coherence, that we get into when our heart and lungs are in sync in biofeedback or doing an intentional breathing exercise, which, believe it or not, for all humans, it's like somewhere between 5 and 7 breaths per minute. Like, we have a heck of a lot more in common than we think we do, you know? And so if you can get people to 5 to 7 breaths per minute, even under situations of extreme stress, they will calm down and think more clearly and make better decisions and feel better. And so we just experimented with that, and we figured out how to do it by just delivering soothing vibrations to the body, and it worked. And then that, over time, through multiple double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover studies and real-world studies in thousands of subjects, ended up actually proving to work and be true. And that became the Apollo product we released in 2020.
The linking between your training, your curiosity to solve something at scale, to innovate and create a product that is grounded, and to use cutting edge medicine, if you will. Dave, I'm stoked on what you're doing. And I just hope that you feel like this insight that you had is that we're made to feel. I hope maybe you can feel the difference that you're making. And I really hope that people in our community because we care. This community, the Finding Mastery community, like really cares about living well for one reason, to help others do the same. We're in some respects, we're the anti-self-help industry because we are, the pro help others industry. But you got to take care of yourself to be able to do that well. And the reason taking care of others is so important is because like no one does it alone, especially the extraordinary. So we need each other. All right, what do you say we do like a round 2 and just dive deep into psychedelics and the mental health kind of opportunity there? What do you think about that?
Anytime.
I would love to do that with you. And where can we drive people right now to start, in your ecosystem to be just a little bit better than they are today?
Well, you can check out, if you want to hear about any of the stuff that we're talking about here, especially on the psychedelic front, I have a couple shows that I've been putting out that are really trying to translate this information better for the community. Because frankly, I feel like the neuroscience and clinical community have done a pretty poor job of passing on the knowledge that we've learned over the years, which is quite substantial. And so I've put together a couple shows with leading experts in the field. One of them is called Your Brain Explained, which is a quarterly show. The very first one is on this exact topic of MDMA-assisted therapy, why it's important, how it works, and how it's changing the way we look at mental health. And that's available on Apple and Spotify. And you can find it at yourbrainexplained.co. And then we also have a show called The Psychedelic Report, which is your single source of truth for the psychedelic news, which is everything under the sun: technology, medicine, natural ways to access altered states of consciousness for healing, and really rethinking healing and giving people an understanding of everything that we have access to in what we call this psychedelic, which does not mean drugs. It means mind expanding, mind revealing. And to really help people understand what's going on the forefront, that's coming straight out of the horse's mouth, straight out of the clinicians and the providers and expert researchers' mouths, which unfortunately are voices we don't hear as often as we should. And you could check that out at thepsychedelicreport.com and hit me up on socials at Dr. David Rabin. I'm always happy to hear from you.
And I want to support like the commitment you've made to our community, which on Apollo Neuro. So it's apolloneuro.com/finding mastery. And you've been gracious enough to give our community a very special discount of 15%, which I know you're not doing for everyone. So we appreciate that. And stoked what you're doing in the world. And I hope our community goes to check you out.
Likewise. And I really appreciate you and all the hard work you're doing and all of the education you provide to the community. It's couldn't be done without a team effort. So thank you.
Let's create a rising tide. All right. Appreciate you, Dave.
See you soon, Michael.